not sure what she just said. I hope it was good. But I also hope your expectations aren't too high. So let me bring those down a little. I'm excited to be here in Madrid to address you today on this topic of optimism and and how does that link with leadership and leaders? And what is that connection? There's been a lot of research about optimists and pessimists in general, and we know that optimists are generally happier, they're smarter, they're better athletes, they do better in school, they do better in politics, they tend to have stronger marriages. So there's all sorts of really great things about optimists. But the question today, what I'd like to explore with you a little bit is, how does that link up with leaders? People that are in charge of getting teams and organizations to move in a certain direction. How does optimism relate to that? And that's what I'd like to share with you today. Before I do, I want to mention something about Pablo. I want to thank Pablo first for organizing this summit. Again, it's great to be here. Those of you who don't know Pablo really well, I can tell you that he is an expert in social media. I've never seen anyone that knows everything about tweeting and pinning, all of these things here. I'm not even sure what they all are, but I did find something on the internet to help explain the difference between all these things. Pablo could tell you this, but I keep this by my desks, so I know what each one of these things is. So we got, first one is Facebook. I like donuts. Twitter, I'm eating a donut right now. Instagram, here's a photo of my donut. Foursquare, this is one I haven't used. This is where I eat donuts. YouTube, you can actually watch me eating a donut. LinkedIn, my skills. It includes eating donuts. And Pinterest, here's a beautiful donut that I actually cooked and made myself. And finally, Last FM, I'm listening to a song about donuts. So I just want to recognize Pablo because he knows all this stuff. I don't. And this is just some good reference and a simple explanation for you if you're like me. But today, again, I want to talk about optimism and leadership. And just so we're on the same page, there's lots of definitions of optimism. For the purposes of my talk this morning, I want to make it just real simple and easy. And I'm just talking about leaders who show and demonstrate hope, enthusiasm, and confidence about the future. That's what I'm going to talk about this morning, that simple definition. What I'd like to do is just kind of cover three key benefits that I've seen and observed, both in some of the research, but also just my own experience as a leader, as an executive, and more recently as an executive coach. So some of the benefits, but there's also a very interesting dilemma that optimists face in their leadership roles, and I want to just briefly talk about that. And then Joe Folkman, my colleague back here, has done some very interesting research just recently on this linkage between the optimistic behaviors that some leaders show and how those are connected to their overall effectiveness and how successful they are at leaders. And so I'll show you some of Joe's recent research and talk about 6 key behaviors that we tend to see in those leaders who are optimistic. Okay, before I jump into optimism, let me talk very briefly about pessimistic leaders. You all may have had the opportunity to work with a pessimistic leader. It's not generally something we like to replicate and repeat, because what we find in pessimistic leaders pretty simply is just the opposite of what I just described. They don't generally have a lot of hope for the future. They're generally not very enthusiastic. It just kind of, it doesn't help the people around them. When they're not showing the hope, the enthusiasm, and the confidence that we can get wherever it is that we're wanting to go. We've done some research about leaders who are not successful. We had a large data set of over 11,000 leaders. We had all of their 360 surveys, and we separated out those that rated as the top 10% of all the leaders, And we compared them with the bottom 10%. We said, what is it? What are the behaviors with this bottom 10% of the leaders that make them so ineffective? We had a separate survey where we looked at over 300 leaders and followed them over several years in one organization. And we found 30 or so of those got fired during that period. And again, we looked at, well, what were the behaviors, what were the unique things that these leaders doing at the bottom who got terminated, and how did they differ from those best leaders? And this is that list. And when you look at that list of these behaviors, what will start to emerge is a lot of these sort of pessimistic kind of approaches in leadership, where I don't feel like I have control over the future, so I'm not very confident about it. I'm probably not very enthusiastic. I don't show enthusiasm. Number 9, I'm resistant to new ideas. Now, this is the person where you go up to the leader and say, I've got a great new innovative idea. The leader response is, the answer is no. Now tell me more about what it is you want to do. Okay? And that's just not very inspiring sort of behavior. So that's kind of what we see in pessimistic leaders. And what I'd like to do now is switch over and let's talk more about those that we see as optimists. Oh, I have one piece of advice. There is sort of some good news if you are working with the pessimists, and a piece of advice I can give you. These are the people you want to borrow money from because they don't ever expect that you're going to pay them back. Okay? So it's not all bad news. Okay, let me just cover quickly kind of 3 benefits that we've observed and I've observed from leaders who I classify as optimistic. The first one is they're more resilient. They're more inspiring in the face of challenges, huge obstacles in front of them, even in the midst of whatever they're trying to achieve when they have setbacks. We know that optimists tend to do better in those situations. Some of you may have seen a very bad American movie called Dumb and Dumber. Anybody familiar? Are you familiar with Dumb and Dumber? One of the lead characters is the comedian Jim Carrey, and there's a famous scene in the movie where he has a love interest, a woman he's very attracted to, and he's talking to her, and he says, so what are the chances that a guy like me could ever end up with a girl like you? And you remember what she says? About 1 in a million. And what is his response as an eternal optimist? So you're telling me there's a chance. You're telling me there's a chance. So there's someone who is resilient. He would keep going and keep driving despite the huge odds against him. Daniel Kahneman has written a great book called Thinking Fast and Slow. He's a Nobel Prize-winning economist. He said the main benefit of optimism is resilience in the face of setbacks, confidence in future success, and it sustains a positive mood of all those people around them, helps them obtain resources, raises morale, enhances the prospects of prevailing. And interesting, he closes with something very close to what we saw here. When action is needed, when you want something to happen, optimism, even in the face of, if it's delusional, still can be a very good thing for you. Okay? So that's number 1 on the benefits list. Second thing is, we know from research that optimists tend to be very good problem solvers. When they run into that challenge, they'll find ways to solve whatever that problem is and improve the situation they're in. I found this funny thing on the internet. This is a high school student taking a trigonometry test, where you have the triangle and there's the hypotenuse, and you've got to find the x. Well, here's how this problem solver, I'm sure this high school student was an optimist, solved it. Find x. Here it is. Found it. Good. Michael Shire is a co-author that was looking at optimism, particularly in the area of the health benefits that optimists have. But what he says here really applies also to leaders. We know why optimists do better than pessimists. It's not that they're not facing reality, it's just that they're problem solvers. They try to go after the situation and fix whatever they're in. They face their problems head on, taking active and constructive steps. Unlike pessimists who are more likely to abandon their efforts as they're trying to achieve whatever goals they're chasing. Okay? Number 3, behaviors are infectious. There's some very interesting research about behaviors and emotions and how they can spread. And we certainly want optimistic leaders to spread this optimism throughout the environment they're in. I remember early in my career, I had a boss who was somewhat of had a tendency to be a pessimist. And you may have experienced this yourselves, where you go into the office every morning, and what's the first thing when you have a pessimistic leader? The first thing that all the workers do? How's the boss today? What's he doing? Is he happy? Is he unhappy? Like what's it like? Because however he's feeling, that's going to be contagious. It's going to spread and impact the environment, and that leader is heading. Okay? So there was an interesting research study done. It's called the Framingham Heart Study, done in an area around Boston. 20-year longitudinal study, really looking at heart health. But the researchers stumbled on some really interesting things about the spreading of happiness in this case, emotion very similar to optimism. And this is a picture that kind of represents what they found. They looked at people who were happy and unhappy, male and female, and they kind of charted them out by location. And I'll show a little blow-up of that picture. So this is sort of a little section of it, and you can see men are squares, women are circles. The dark color indicates more happiness. Light color indicates less happiness. And they had this interesting result that they observed is this thing they've called emotional contagion. And this clustering that they saw here wasn't the result because, Bob is a happy person, and I see Fred is happy, so I'm going to go over and hang out with Fred. In fact, the reason Bob was happy is because he knows Fred, and Fred was happy, and that contagion spread to Bob. Okay, so it wasn't that I elected to associate with him. It's that his happiness influenced my happiness. And in fact, what they found, they measured this and said, if person A lives within a mile, physically within a mile of person B, and person B becomes happy, there's a 25% more probability that person A will be happy, just because of this emotional contagion. And one of the other interesting results is that happens up to with 3 degrees of separation. So not just me with this person, but also this and this. This person out here can even have an impact on my happiness. And the particular instrument that they used here was also validated to say, it also is true. This instrument will measure what they call positive affect, which is very similar to optimism. It'd be very, very highly correlated. Okay? So this idea of being optimistic or pessimistic, it's going to be contagious, which is another reason why we really like to see optimistic leaders. Okay, one caution for optimistic leaders. We got Homer Simpson, which is to me sort of a classic optimist. I don't think he knows all the time really what's going on, but he's really optimistic about it. And this leads into kind of a dilemma. Is the confidence in the enthusiasm that optimistic leaders have, is it unwarranted or is it warranted? Should they have it or shouldn't they have it? And this is one of the things, it's really a caution if you are optimistic as a leader. Because what we know, again, generally is from research, is the optimists are prone to various cognitive biases, and it results in them taking risks that maybe they shouldn't, and underestimating or even overlooking some dangers, okay, because of their optimism, because of their enthusiasm and the confidence that they have. These can be dangerous. And let me just list a couple of them. One is this interesting concept called the Dunning-Kruger effect, named after 2 professors at Cornell that have written papers on it, that they call illusory superiority. And they actually have a paper called Unskilled and Unaware of It. And what the research that they did found was the less skillful you are in just about anything, the less skillful you are, the more likely it is you to overestimate how good you are at it. Okay? And conversely, the more skilled you are, the more likely it is to underestimate how skilled you are. Okay? So this can be a real problem, especially for Homer here, who's optimistic and go, 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 and I can achieve anything, when in fact he doesn't realize that he's not very good at what that skill might be. So this is one of those cognitive biases that deserves some caution. Second one, confirmation bias. Have any of you ever bought, you've researched, studied it, and then finally bought the ultimate car that you wanted? This was the car. I've been waiting for this car. You got the car. And after you did all the research and you read all the articles and you purchased the car, you then kind of avoid reading any other articles that might be critical of the decision that you've made. Have you ever done that kind of thing? Yeah, that's called confirmation bias, and the tendency that we have to focus on what we know or what we believe and kind of neglect, overlook, or discount what doesn't fit with our belief. Okay? So again, this can be a problem for an optimistic leader, again, leading to underestimating the dangers and the risks the leader faces. And this last one here is leaders can sometimes view the results that they've achieved or positive outcomes that they're expecting and attribute them to their own skills and talents rather than to luck. And by luck, what I mean there is some of the impact and the results coming from factors that were actually not in control of the person. It might have been the economy suddenly took off, and that has a large degree, helps the results of my company. Or some other event, a natural disaster, something like that can have a big impact. Often optimists discount the impact of outside influences and attribute things to themselves. And that's particularly true, the research shows, for positive events. Optimists tend to say if it's a positive event, it was because of me. And interestingly, if it was a negative event, it was because of some outside influence, right? So that can be a little bit dangerous and a little bit of a caution. Again, I'll go back to Daniel Kahneman. This is to me perfect illustration of this. Most people look at the world as more benign than it is, our attributes more favorable than they really are, and the goals that we adopt are more achievable than they are. Okay? And we tend to exaggerate our ability to forecast the future. All of these things helping foster this caution of being overly optimistic, being overly confident. This ties back to the common philosophy or the common research you've seen in a lot of different areas, but I know in America when they do surveys and they say, how many of you think that you're an above average driver? It's like 90% of the people think they're above average drivers, Well, that actually can't be, right, statistically. But we just have that confidence, as Kahneman describes here. There's another researcher, I think she's at the University of North Carolina, named Barbara Fredrickson, that's done a lot of work in positivity and optimism. And she says to help counter this, the way to think of it, the metaphor that she uses is a sailboat. And above the waterline, you have these huge sails, which are a great thing. That's what's going to capture the wind and drive and push you and move you forward to achieve your goals. But you really need to think also there needs to be some caution. That's represented by the keel. Underwater, there needs to be something that's helping balance all of that optimism. So I think that's a good metaphor to think about if you are an optimist or you work with optimists. Let's go full speed ahead, but we need some sort of rudder or keel to make sure that we stay on track. Now, in an organization, that's often a role. If your CEO is a supercharging optimist, that can be a role, for example, played by a CFO or maybe a COO to help temper and bring some realism to the optimistic nature of the leader. Now, why is all of this so important? This whole area of optimism, why is that so important in the context of leadership? And this goes back to the research that Joe has done. This is a data set of over 200 leaders. It was a global food and beverage company. And what we measured on a 360-degree survey, we had all the people around the leader say, where is this leader in terms of optimism? And they ranked them from low levels of optimism to high levels of optimism. And then compared that to their overall effectiveness as a leader. So what do you think about the optimism of the leader and how effective overall is the leader? And these were the results of the study. And a very incredible correlation between how you're perceived in terms of your level of optimism and how you're perceived in overall effectiveness as a leader. So clear correlation, just like we see high correlations between optimists and health or marriage, or another one I didn't mention earlier, salespeople, where they measured optimism levels of salespeople. The optimistic sales folks sell significantly more than the pessimistic ones do. They're much more successful. Okay? So this level of optimism also falls over into your effectiveness as a leader and how you're perceived. So it's critical. Now, why is that critical? Why do we care about how people perceive us as leaders on a 360 survey? When we do thousands and thousands of surveys all over the world, all different cultures, all different languages, and we chart this, something that looks like this, and we find the same result every time. When we have people rate the leader on their effectiveness, and then we look at other independent measures of employee engagement, employee commitment, employee satisfaction, customer satisfaction, profitability, whatever business outcome you want to measure, and you try to correlate that with how the leader's perceived on a 360 survey, it always looks like this, always. And that arrow may be higher or lower, the slope may change slightly, but we always see this direct correlation to how effective the leader is perceived and whatever the outcome is that we're measuring. So when I link this back to the previous slide on optimism, it says, wow, this is pretty interesting. This is pretty important. Now, some of the good news is that Joe dove into the data and also took a look at what are some of the underlying behaviors that cause people to classify someone as optimistic or pessimistic. And these are some of the behaviors that came out of the data and out of the research that he did. And these all fit, I think, with most of our traditional beliefs about optimism and optimistic leaders. I'm not going to go through each one, but I'm going to mention one that I think is really important, just from my experience and my coaching and working with teams, and that's making mistakes momentary. This is one of the really important things that the great optimistic leaders do. Carol Dweck, a professor at Stanford, has done a lot of work in the area of mindset and how people look at life, and in this case, your jobs and how you lead. And there are people with what she calls fixed mindsets. And so the skills I bring, the talents I bring, all the things I can do are kind of fixed. And I'm going to bring those to whatever assignment I have. But if I'm not successful, I get a little bit pessimistic because that's all I got. That's all I can do, and it's fixed. And she, in her research, shows that there's another group of folks that she says have a growth mindset, that we actually can continue to learn, we can continue to develop. And probably the most important aspect of that is people with growth mindsets don't mind failure, because failure is an opportunity to learn and grow and develop. Whereas people with fixed mindsets, they were going to avoid situations where they might not make it because they don't see that as a possibility. So this idea of making mistakes momentary is where an optimistic leader will encourage the team to stretch and grow and develop. And a mistake is okay. Let's recover and let's move on. And what did we learn from it? And let's keep going and let's do better the next time. Let me close with from the American Indian, from the Cherokee Nation. There's an old proverb, and it has to do with a wise old Cherokee elder talking with his grandson. And he's explaining to the grandson that there's a constant battle going on continually in all people between two wolves that are inside us. And he explains to his grandson, one of the wolves is negativity, anger, sadness, stress, contempt, disgust, etc. That's one wolf. The other wolf on the other shoulder is positivity. And positivity is joy and gratitude, serenity, hope. And you can see kind of the correlation between pessimism and optimism here. So this battle's constantly going on, and the grandson takes it all in and then finally says to his grandfather, well, which is the wolf that wins? And the grandfather thinks for a moment and says, it's going to be the one that you feed. Okay? And so I would just encourage you, as you think about optimism in the workplace, especially with your leaders, be thinking about those two wolves. The research has shown, Martin Seligman and others, that only a small part of optimism is heritable. In other words, your genes can contribute to that a little bit, but most of it is a learned behavior, and you can learn to be optimistic. You can change by the kind of feeding that you do. Thank you very much. Enjoyed talking to you.